Next on Secrets of War, American pilots battle the enemy and their own political leaders in the skies over Vietnam. Exclusive interviews with North Vietnamese veterans, secret American operations in Laos and Cambodia, and the Navy's classified program to counter heavy losses against Vietnamese pilots. Or were these pilots from other communist countries? Alpha Strike is next on Secrets of War.
The American war in Vietnam. There were no front lines drawn on the map, no neatly marked positions defining enemy territory or safe territory. American tactics produced numerous battlefield victories and inflicted heavy military losses on the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. But these opportunities were often wasted by the absence of strategic vision. The U.S. air war in Vietnam cost more than half of the hundreds of millions of dollars America spent on the hostilities. Despite this investment, air power, while influential, was never decisive.
We had gotten into the war without understanding what the game plan was. We had no strategy, we had no objective. We thought it was going to be another quick and easy fight, rush in, fill the sky with airplanes, and we'd walk away the big winner, as we always have had in the past. And it didn't work.
Vietnam has a 2,000-year history of resisting foreign invasions. They'd been fighting for over a century against the French, the Japanese, and then the French again. For the Vietnamese, time and cost meant little. Their war against the Americans would last as long as it took to win. If they did not succeed, then their children would, or their grandchildren.
Our slogan at that time was just to fight. We know that as long as the Americans decided to stay and get involved with the Vietnam War, it would be impossible, to reunify the country.
Like their French predecessors in the First Indochina War, American leaders and the government of South Vietnam never understood that the communists were willing to lose longer than the Americans were willing to win.
We accept the death of millions of people. We justify this huge loss because of the belief that the independence for our country will justify the sacrifice. We don't put a limit on the number of human lives lost. Independence is the most precious thing we must have.
So we would do everything to fight and discourage the Americans from getting involved and make life really difficult for them so that they would withdraw from Vietnam and leaving the internal affairs of the Vietnamese to the Vietnamese.
Most historians date the U.S. air war from 1962 to 1973. In fact, the U.S. Air Force had been quietly sending advisors to South Vietnam as early as 1950 to support the French in the First Indochina War. This assistance continued after Ho Chi Minh led the communist Viet Minh to victory over the French at Dien Bien Phu and the partitioning of Vietnam into the North and the South in 1955.
Essentially, the air war in Vietnam can be broken down into three parts. There was Rolling Thunder from 65 to 68. There was the interdiction in Laos from 68 through 72, and then the linebacker campaigns in 72.
With the South Vietnamese government on the verge of collapse, on the 2nd of March, 1965, the United States began an aerial bombing campaign against North Vietnam. From the beginning, Operation Rolling Thunder was characterized by a sharp conflict, pitting the military against President Lyndon Johnson and his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. At issue were the rules of engagement. American pilots were not allowed to go downtown, their term for bombing military targets in Hanoi.
In the first 3 or 4 years of the war, there's no doubt that the White House controlling the air battle, the rules of engagement, and saying that some targets could and could not be hit, trying to delineate where the air effort would go in against the advice of the air planners. I think that that was a major fault.
President Johnson and Secretary McNamara alternated gradual escalation with long bombing halts in a belief that they could lure the North Vietnamese, led by Ho Chi Minh and General Nguyen Giap, to the negotiating table. Against the advice of his senior military commanders, Johnson personally approved and picked each military target.
Johnson's idea was that people would get more and more fearful as the bombs got closer and closer, but what it really did is it gave the Vietnamese an opportunity to fine-tune their air defense system so that by the time the bombs did get to Hanoi, they had the most sophisticated air defense system in the world.
Johnson feared that a full-scale bombing campaign might trigger a Chinese or Russian military response, never suspecting the depth of both countries' involvement in North Vietnam's air defenses.
The American politicians were very concerned that we'd have a rerun of the Korean War, where once the North Koreans had been started to be pushed back, the Chinese started to get involved in a big way and almost tipped the balance. The thought of having Mao's guerrilla army of 5 million men suddenly available to General Giap, I think, was something which the Americans were very concerned about.
Johnson believed in the carrot and stick approach. Hit your opponent over the head with a stick, and then offer him a little piece of carrot. He was convinced that limited bombing raids would persuade Hanoi to negotiate rather than face an all-out offensive. But Johnson and McNamara were making a critical miscalculation. They failed to understand their enemy.
They did not understand communism. They certainly did not understand that Ho Chi Minh was an international communist, and that was his primary mission in life, was to advance communism.
Johnson was a Texas politician. His problem is that he didn't understand the Vietnamese worldview, that this carrot and stick approach was not something that they understood, and that's not how they operated. The only thing the Vietnamese understood was force.
The majority of missions for Operation Rolling Thunder were carried out by U.S. Air Force planes based in Thailand and by Navy squadrons flying from Yankee Station, the code name for carriers based in the South China Sea. A line just below Vinh, North Vietnam, formed the northern boundary above which air attacks were initially forbidden. Most North Vietnamese fighter bases and surface-to-air missiles fell within these restricted areas.
When the SAM sites were first brought in, we could see them being calibrated by the Russians and the Chinese and being readied for action against us. Yet we were specifically forbidden to hit a SAM site until that site had been verified as operational And of course, it became operational once it started shooting at us and knocking our people down.
A newly uncovered classified Soviet document, encoded telegram number 13987, verifies that it was in fact Soviet soldiers who shot down 5 American planes in the first SAM missile attack of the Vietnam War in July 1965. Encoded telegram 13987 goes on to describe deep, often bitter, Russian, Chinese, and Vietnamese political differences. The so-called international brotherhood that Johnson and McNamara feared was actually strained by cultural tensions and political disagreements.
The China card was a big farce. Internally, China was going through great problems. They were very unstable. They were frightened about the Russian attitude. The Russians and the Chinese were at each other's throat.
The relationship between Russia and Vietnam during the war was awful. It was very belligerent, and the Vietnamese actually were quite adept of working the lines between China and Russia in order to continue their efforts.
The other thing you have to remember is the historical antipathy between the Vietnamese and the Chinese people. They hate each other, and they have fought 3 wars over the sovereignty of areas in the north of the country in the last 100 years alone. These are not people who are natural allies.
U.S. air crews complained that they had to fly with one eye reading the rule book and one eye looking for the enemy. The frustration pilots felt with Johnson's approach to the air war, its rules of engagement and political legacy of micromanaged control, exploded on the 2nd of June, 1967. A Soviet freighter named the Turkestan was strafed in a harbor 40 miles south of Haiphong. Technically, the Soviet Union was neutral, but American air crews had long suspected that Soviet freighters were carrying military supplies to the north. The Soviet Union demanded an apology. To protect his men from investigation, Colonel Jack Broughton immediately destroyed the gun camera film without seeing it. But within a week, the U.S. apologized, and Broughton and his 2 pilots were court-martialed.
I was charged with 4 counts of conspiracy against the United States government, as were my 2 pilots. But I got them off, and I got the case against me thrown out as the grossest miscarriage of military justice in history.
This war was unlike anything the American military had ever experienced. The failure of U.S. air power to incapacitate North Vietnam's overall war effort in the South remains